It was morning, and the air was filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and warmth permeating every cell of my body. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, and time seemed to slow down when I saw those 2 pink stripes for the first time in years. I knew it could be everything I had been longing for, but despite all the years of waiting, I couldn't quite believe what was happening was real. The test in my hands was starting to become inexorably heavy. I leaned back against the table and looked at myself in the mirror, smiling nervously. There was a look of joy and anxiety on my face at the same time. My gaze slid around the room, and I suddenly realized how much things would change. This test meant life, joy, a new beginning. It meant that maybe all of our attempts and endeavors with Nathan, the long years of frustration and disappointment, had finally come to fruition. My heart was racing. I can't say I wasn't happy. Of course I was happy. 3 home tests showed me the same thing. I was pregnant. After all the setbacks, after the seemingly futility, it had finally happened. I squeezed my eyes shut, thanking the universe for this moment. But honestly, I didn't know how Nathan would react. We'd been trying to conceive for years. He was consumed with work, consumed with his career, and me, I was always there for him. Nathan told me there was love, but I was beginning to think it was all just part of a bigger plan, part of his life in which I played the role of wife. A wife who, of course, was to bear an heir. All this time, I'd been trying to figure out why his mother was so endlessly dissatisfied with me, why her teasing about me not being able to give an emperor to their empire was getting harsher and harsher. Now it seemed the moment had finally arrived when I could say, "There, I've done it. Nathan and I are expecting a child. He's the one who will carry on his work." With the thought that I could now win at least a little bit of this endless struggle for his attention and approval, I got up and walked to the window. It was morning outside the glass, and the street was bathed in soft light. The quiet city was waking up, and I was holding 2 small does in my hands. In that moment, I felt everything around me freeze. There was me, my baby, and Nathan in this world. There was no one else. I remembered how lately I had been feeling more and more detached from Nathan. We were no longer the family I had envisioned at the beginning of our marriage. More and more, I felt like I had become a part of his success, not his life. With his mother, Eleanor, those feelings only grew more vivid, and I grew accustomed to her making all of her decisions without him and me. It was a quiet challenge to be around a man whose dreams, ambitions, and desires always came first, and me, I was just following him. But now there was more than just roles. This was an important moment when I could become a mother, when my life took on new meaning, when I could offer him not just the business, but what we had created together. I smiled, breathing a sigh of relief. That fear I had felt when we first started trying was gone, and in its place came immense joy. I could finally do this. I walked over to the phone to send a text to Nathan, but at that moment I felt a strange tension in the air, like something wasn't right. When I turned around, I noticed my fingers trembling as I involuntarily clutched the test in my hands. I looked in the mirror again, and I was overcome with the feeling that this joy might be too good to be true. Suddenly, in that moment, I felt the world around me begin to change. I opened the door and felt the sounds from the living room suddenly grow louder, more distinct. Quiet footsteps on the wooden floor seemed to slide into my hearing. The voices in the living room became more and more apparent. I wasn't prepared to hear what transpired at this moment. I hadn't expected to meet them so early, to face this nightmare without having had a chance to prepare myself in any way yet. As I got closer to the door, I heard them talking, and I froze. "She still can't give us an heir, Nathan," Eleanor said. Her voice was so cold, so calculating, it was like it cut the air around me. I felt the lump in my throat prevent me from breathing. "We have to do something. We don't have time to wait." I darkened at the phrase. I knew she wasn't talking about some inheritance or children, but something much bigger, much harsher. I walked to the door and froze. Nathan, standing next to her mother, was ominously silent. I saw something in his gaze that I didn't want to see. He didn't argue, didn't object. I heard her say, "We brought her here. Now she will stay, and this child will be our heir." And that's when I realized that they weren't talking about inheritance or the future or children. They were talking about business, about calculation, about sacrifice. Standing at the door, I didn't yet know that this would be the end of everything I'd been building. All the years Nathan and I had spent together, all our combined efforts and feelings. I was ready to meet him with the news that I thought would be the beginning of something new. But I found myself standing on the brink of ruining my life. My hands shook and I realized that I had to act. I just couldn't stand there and listen to them without saying something. All I felt at that moment was pain. Pain that no money or status could save me from. I took a step forward and stepped into the room. All I could do was watch their gazes shift to me. Nathan stood in the center of the room, his face remaining emotionless as it always was when he didn't want to show anything. But I knew him. In his eyes, I could already see the answer to all my questions. Eleanor met my gaze, her cold, confident smile only emphasizing her authority. Nathan's secretary, Vanessa, sat on the couch with an expression of slight surprise, but soon her face took on a more composed look, as if she were used to these situations. In her hand was her stomach, which was slightly rounded, and that was the final straw in making everything inside me flip. "You're back," Nathan said, and his voice wasn't warm or cold. It was just a fact, like the fact that I was his wife and Vanessa was his mistress. That moment when I had to hear my life ruined, I just couldn't say anything. It was all said without further ado. "You're with her?" I finally squeezed out, feeling the pain pierce me to the core. I saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who no longer saw the point in explaining. He nodded. Period. All I could think about was how he'd put his career, his legacy, above me. All those years I'd spent by his side, working for his success, were just part of his scheme. Business and family life became one, but at some point I realized that I was just a shadow, an empty place that couldn't fill the void of his ambition. Eleanor, as expected, stepped in. She always knew how to take control in situations like this. She looked at me with the same cold confidence that had haunted me since the moment I met her. She'd always been in the thick of things, and I'd spent so long trying to figure out how much influence she had over Nathan. It was clear now. "You don't have to worry, sweetheart," she began, addressing me with some strange amount of pity that I couldn't accept. "Vanessa will stay in the guest part of the house until permanent housing is found. We'll keep things under control." And that's when I realized that none of this had anything to do with me, our relationship, or even our future child. It was all part of a plan in which I was just a pawn. I felt her words, not just squeezing my heart, but tearing it apart. Eleanor didn't realize that I wasn't here to discuss who would live in our house, who would be the heir. I had come here with news that could have turned everything around, but instead, I was being greeted as just another woman who would follow all the rules of this game. I glanced at Nathan and felt him start to lose meaning to me. He stood there, silent, and I suddenly realized that I couldn't go on with this life anymore. I picked up the box of cake I'd bought for him and set it on the table, and quietly, but with a sense of final determination, I said, "I will not be a part of this game." And with those words, I turned around and headed for the door. I knew it was the right decision, but my heart was breaking with pain. All I wanted was to be important to the man I loved, and it turned out I was just part of his big business. It hurt. As I closed the door behind me, I felt my knees go weak, but I didn't let myself fall. I couldn't let myself be weak. I walked out of the house without looking back. It was over. Leaving Nathan wasn't a simple step, but I knew that if I didn't do it now, I'd be trapped in a place I could never get out of. I walked quickly past the house we'd once moved into with such excitement, past all the expensive things we'd purchased together, and past all the illusion I'd created for myself to believe our marriage was real. But I knew now that it was actually built on lies, on illusions created to please his mother, to please the business, but not me. I called my brother James, who had long since retired from the family business. He was the only person who could understand me. When I told him I needed to leave, he agreed to help without question. He said he would be there in half an hour. Instantly, I felt the heavy burden begin to lift a little because I knew that now I didn't need to be a part of this game anymore. Ignoring my feelings, I made my decision and started packing. Everything I took with me was what I really needed: important documents, a few pictures that reminded me of our past, and some clothes. With each move, I felt the life I was leaving behind become more and more foreign to me. I signed the divorce papers that my attorney surfaced like waves, returning at the most unexpected moment. One day, when I had finished another project and my clients had left, I sat down at my desk to take a little break. It was one of those days when the city was filled with the smell of fresh air and the summer sun was playing outside. I relaxed as I closed my eyes and thought about how far I had come. I didn't expect it to be like this. Things were so much better than I could have imagined, and I felt proud of myself. I was no longer dependent on Nathan, on his ambition, on his mother. Everything I created was mine alone, and that was important. But at that moment, I noticed an envelope in my mailbox that caught my eye: Nathan's handwriting. My heart hit bottom when I saw it. I knew it wasn't just a letter. I knew he was going to talk. I knew that his world, a world I no longer belonged to, was real to me again. I didn't open the envelope for a long time, not sure how to react. But finally, pulling myself together, I tore open the envelope and began to read. He wrote that he needed to talk, that he wanted to explain himself, that he realized he had lost a lot. I couldn't believe my eyes when I read that he was remorseful for what had happened, that he wanted to take it all back. What I saw in his words was not sincerity, but empty regret, which I hadn't taken seriously in a long time. He continued that he needed time to realize his mistakes, that he was confused and didn't know what to do. It was everything I had once expected him to be. Empty words, promises I could no longer accept. I realized I didn't need his explanation. I didn't expect him to come back and fight for me. All I had to do was continue to live my life. He couldn't give me back what was lost. I took a deep breath, placing the letter on the table. I wasn't going to be a part of his world anymore. This letter was the last reminder of what I had chosen to leave behind. The letter from Nathan remained on my desk. It took me a long time to decide what to do with it. But in the end, I decided I wouldn't go back to it. I couldn't let his presence interfere with my life again. My decision was made. I wasn't going back into this world that had been so forced upon me. I decided to answer him, but not in the way he expected. I wasn't going to ask for his forgiveness or expect him to apologize in any way. I was the kind of person who no longer believed what he said. I was ready to live my life regardless of what was going on around me. I wrote a short letter telling him that I wasn't going to continue our communication. I thanked him for all that was good and closed that chapter for good. The letter was sent. I felt relief fill me, like a release from everything that bound me to that past. I was no longer a part of that game, no longer a part of his family, and I wasn't going to go back to what had hurt me so badly. I felt free again, freedom to be myself, freedom from other people's expectations, freedom to be who I really was. I realized that my present wasn't Nathan or Eleanor or their business. My present is me, my path, my decisions. In those moments, I felt confident in myself again. My future was in my hands, and I was no longer dependent on what others thought. I became a person who chooses her own path, not someone who is led by someone else's rules. I was back to myself, and now I didn't care what was going on in Nathan's world. I was happy in what I had created. I was happy that I could be myself. Everything that had happened since I'd left Nathan began to take shape. My life in the small coastal town was getting brighter and brighter, like the sun on the horizon when morning comes. I was free. My business was thriving. I was learning to relearn to live for myself, and every day brought me something new. Even so, when I received the news of my father's illness, something inside me changed. He was someone I had been trying to understand for a long time, and his attitude towards me had always left more questions than answers. When I learned that he didn't have much time left, I felt everything inside of me clench. No matter how much I tried to escape this world, that moment had come. My father, William, was a man who never showed feelings. He was always consumed with business ambition. I was always just part of his empire, part of what he could control. I knew that if he left, nothing but his inheritance would rest on me. But despite everything, I still felt I needed to see him. I needed to know what he thought about everything that had happened in our family, about how I had walked away, leaving everything behind. Maybe I was looking for answers I couldn't get when I was around him. Maybe I was just looking for closure, for the realization that now I was no longer dependent on his opinion, no longer dependent on his business. I couldn't just stay and watch everything fall apart. I knew I needed to confront him to finally realize that I was choosing my own path and that I would no longer live by his rules. I got in my car and drove to the hospital. It was a long drive, and I couldn't shake the strange feeling that this was some kind of closure. I knew that I would no longer seek my father's approval, that everything I had built was now mine. But still, when I stopped outside the hospital and looked at his name on the plaque, I felt this place connected to my past. When I walked into his room, it felt like time had stopped. He lay there, weak, weary with illness, and I, standing by the bedside, felt how many unspoken words remained between us. William Thompson was not a man to be spoken to lightly. His face remained as hard and unapproachable as ever. His eyes were closed, but I knew he could hear me. I sat next to him, squeezing his hand, trying not to show how hard it was for me. I knew he was always busy with his business and never cared about how his children felt. But in that moment, in this room with nothing but silence and the faint sounds from the monitors, I felt like maybe he did realize that I was part of his life after all, not just a business partner. We were silent for a few minutes, and I thought about how many times I'd tried to earn his attention, his love. I was his daughter, but I never felt like he appreciated me for the person I was. I was part of his plans, part of his empire, and maybe that's why I ran away. I realized I couldn't build my life if I was constantly seeking his approval. At some point, he opened his eyes. There was no surprise or alarm in his gaze. It was the look of a man who knew that time had run out. He looked at me with some strange expression on his face and said a few words that I will remember forever. "You made the right choice, Olivia. It wasn't yours." I didn't know what to say back. Those words were like a stone that fell on my heart. He understood. He knew that I couldn't continue to be a part of this world. He understood that I was searching for my path, and that I had chosen to be me rather than continue to follow in his footsteps. I felt his words, despite their simplicity, open up a new world in front of me. It was the moment I realized I no longer needed his approval, his involvement in my life. Everything I did was for me, and in that moment I felt him finally let me go, realizing that I had chosen my own path that wasn't connected to his world. Despite all the hard experiences I had had over the years, as I stood at my father's bedside, I felt something important that had been inside of me begin to change. It was a strange feeling of release, as if the heavy burden I had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. I saw something in his eyes that I'd never been able to see before, an acknowledgement that I'd been able to break free of his control, that I'd chosen my own path. He seemed to finally accept that fact. There were no regrets. I wasn't seeking his forgiveness, and he wasn't offering me forgiveness. It was simply an acknowledgement that our paths were diverging. I wasn't a part of his world, and he may have realized it too late. That night, I didn't leave the hospital right away. I stayed by his side, looking at that weak figure that had once been such a strong man. I thought about how he had always put business and success first, and now that he was on the brink, he was realizing that none of that mattered. I was his daughter, and all I was looking for was the opportunity to be me. I closed my eyes as his breathing became faint, and the monitor next to the bed began to make a strange sound. He opened his eyes again, and I saw his gaze become a little clearer, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. In that moment, despite all the pain, I realized everything he wanted to say to me had been said. He had set me free. William Thompson, my father, was someone who was always consumed with his business, his ambition. But in the last moments of his life, he realized that family came first. Perhaps that was the last lesson he taught me. When the nurses entered the room to check on his condition, I realized it was time. I stood up, placed his hand on my head, and whispered words of goodbye. Those words weren't for him, they were for me. I was saying goodbye to that world, to that man who might not have been able to understand me, but in the end realized that I was making my choice. I left the room, and despite the gravity of the situation, I felt a lightness appear in my chest. Maybe that lightness had to do with the fact that I was finally realizing that I was no longer dependent on his opinion. I wasn't part of his strategy. I was an independent woman, and now I could make my own life. When I got home, there were so many thoughts that it wasn't easy for me to find time for myself. I sat on the terrace of my new home, watching the sunset and thinking about what had happened recently. My father was gone, and now I was free from his influence. I could be myself again, regardless of what others expected. I was ready to go on with my life, not caring what was going on in the world of the people who had once been important to me. But soon I received news that my father, William, had changed his will. He specified that his entire company would pass to me, not my cousin Albert as everyone thought. It was unexpected. I didn't expect him to do that. But when I read the document, I realized that now that I was independent, I had another challenge ahead of me. It wasn't just about inheritance, but also about how I could be the mistress of my future. My first feeling was doubt. I didn't want to go back into that world. I didn't want to accept what was involved in the business that was the foundation of our entire family. But then I realized that this was my chance. This was my decision. I could keep the independence I had and use that inheritance in my own way. It was my right to take responsibility and take the company in a new direction. I realized that this could also mean a complicated relationship with Nathan and his mother. Eleanor probably wouldn't be happy about me taking control of the assets, but now I was ready to face it head on. This was my moment, and I couldn't afford to be afraid of what awaited me. The next day, I began discussions with family attorneys and businessmen to figure out how I would manage my inheritance. At one point, I even had to meet with Albert, my cousin, who had always been certain that the company would pass to him. Our conversation was tense, but I knew it was necessary. I had to do everything I could to keep my family safe and at the same time, keep my way. Nathan reached out to me. His voice was tired, but with a sincere tinge of regret. "Are you really going to take all this on?" he asked. I answered firmly, "Yes, Nathan, I'm going to, and I'm going to do it by my own rules." He was silent, but I knew it was a sign. I was no longer dependent on his decision, on his approval. I was making my own choices. It had been a few weeks since I'd made the decision to take over the family company. The move felt both light and heavy at the same time, and I could feel every cell in my body preparing for something big, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. This was the moment of truth. I wasn't just leaving Nathan behind, I was leaving behind the entire system that had been built around him, around his mother, around their ruthless approach to business. I sat in my office, surrounded by papers, reports, and a plethora of business proposals. My attention was focused on the project I needed to complete. I thought about what was to come, how I would need to take responsibility for everything about the company. But in that moment, it became clear to me that I shouldn't continue to be a part of the world that belonged to Nathan and Eleanor. I couldn't go back into it. I was going to build it all over again, and it wasn't going to be just another attempt to play by someone else's rules. I was going to do something of my own. Nathan kept sending me texts and emails, trying to convince me that I should work with him, that together we could make the company stronger. But his words sounded hollow. He said he wanted back into my life, but I already realized that his want was aimed at one goal: to get me back into his world, a world where I was nothing more than a tool, an element in his scheme. I couldn't allow myself to be sucked back into that relationship. I couldn't let him and his family dictate to me what I should do, what was right. I realized that this probably wasn't going to be an easy step. I might be alone in this decision, and I might have to fight those who expected me to submit. But I was ready. I looked around my office and smiled, feeling proud of what I had done. I had created this place on my own, without the help of Nathan, without the help of his wealth. I worked here, with people who valued me for what I did, not for what I had to offer in exchange for my freedom. This was my place, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. It wasn't even a week after I'd finally come into my own that I had to meet Nathan face to face. He arrived at my office, demure and businesslike, but I could see his tense face giving away everything he was trying to hide. We didn't talk right away, no greetings, no small talk about how the day went. We started right away with the main thing. "You realize this is a huge risk, don't you?" Nathan said, his eyes throwing sparks. "You can't do this alone. You know you'll be haunted by everything we've built together." His voice was firm, but there was a sense of confusion in it. He hadn't expected me to take such a step. I sat across from him, feeling his words like they were penetrating me, trying to make me doubt, but I was no longer the kind of woman who could afford to second-guess her decisions. I was free, and I could feel the strength I had gained helping me to be decisive. "I know it's a risk," I replied calmly, "but I can't keep being part of a game that doesn't make sense. I'm not going to be a shadow of what you're building again." I noticed his face darken as his confidence began to fade. Nathan leaned forward, trying to find a weakness in my words. He'd always been able to manipulate the situation, always been able to turn things around so that he stayed in the winning position. But now it wasn't working for me anymore. I wasn't his weak link. I was the master of my life. "You think you can handle this? You know how this world works. You can't just walk away from everything we've built." His voice was quiet, but I could feel him trying to be persistent, how he was trying to pull me back into his web, but I was ready. "I can handle it, Nathan, and I'm already coping. It's none of your business how I run the company. You're no longer a part of my life, and I'm not going back into this world." My words were firm, and I saw his face redden with anger, but he said nothing. The silence in the room was almost palpable. I realized that this was the end. Everything we had tried to build together had crumbled, and it couldn't be rebuilt. In his eyes, I saw not only anger but also some shadow of disappointment. He knew I was right. He knew I wasn't going back to it. "Are you sure?" he finally asked. I remained silent, and despite his best efforts, I felt myself remain tight. I knew this was the moment of the final breakup. It was goodbye not only to him, but to the world he represented. When Nathan left, I felt like a heavy burden had been lifted off of me. Even though the meeting had been tense, and I could feel his words still echoing in my head, I knew I had made the right move. I stayed true to myself and my decision. It was like hitting the brakes in a world where everything revolved around other people's expectations and manipulations. Immediately after he left, I sat down at my desk in my office again. The walls were surrounded by projects, schedules, and emails from clients, but it all became something secondary. I knew I had a lot of challenges ahead of me, especially that Nathan wouldn't give up. He was part of an old, big, cruel game, and I knew he would fight to take it all back. But now I was ready for it. No matter how much he tried to manipulate, I was no longer the type of person who would allow myself to give in to his desires. I knew it would be hard for him to accept that I was choosing my path, but I had already accepted my role, and now I no longer needed his consent or his approval. I was making my own life, and that was my right. My studio continued to thrive. With each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger, more in control of my world and working with people who appreciated me for my present. I was no longer a toy in someone else's hands. I was the master of my own destiny. But at some point, I realized that I would need to take it a step further to preserve and protect all that I had built. I had to be prepared not only for the business negotiations, but also for the personal challenges I faced because of my decision to act against the will of Nathan and his mother. Eventually, I contacted my attorney and requested assistance for next steps. We began working to protect my company and its assets. I knew that Nathan and Eleanor would not just watch me build my empire. They would fight to get everything back into their own hands, but I was ready for that fight. I knew my future depended on how I acted in this moment. This fight was just beginning. Though I was still haunted by their attempts to get me back in their game, I was determined. I couldn't let them win. My choice had been made, and I was going to follow through. As the process with attorneys and business negotiations entered its active phase, I became increasingly aware of how important every step I took was. I carefully planned every action, vetting every aspect of my business and assuring myself that I was ready for any challenge. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something bigger. I was preparing myself for the hardest part, being on the front lines, fighting not only for my independence but also for my future. My day started early and ended late. At some point, I realized that I was living in a constant state of tension, constantly on guard. But inside me, confidence was growing. I realized that despite everything, I was in control. I could control my life, and that gave. Had prepared back a couple months ago when I first suspected that Nathan wasn't being honest with me. All these years, I'd sensed something was wrong, but I'd been afraid to admit to myself that our family had been loveless for a long time. And now, as I held these papers in my hands, I felt like I could finally move on. My life wasn't over. It was simply the end of one journey and the beginning of another. As I walked toward the exit, I took another look at the house, but this one wasn't full of regret. I knew that leaving this place was the only right thing to do. I couldn't be a part of this lie anymore. I called James, and within a minute, he was there. Time to leave. Time to start over. When I walked into the house, my heart still couldn't process what had just happened. I froze for a moment, standing in the hallway, clutching the box of tiramisu in my hands. My head kept working, as did my heart, trying to find answers to what I had just learned. Nathan's words rang in my head, his calm voice, as if he were talking about some business, not our marriage, not me and him. At first I thought it all seemed like some kind of nightmare, not reality. I couldn't believe that I was standing in this house, in this place where every memory was connected to moments when we were happy. We made plans for the future. We dreamed of children, of a perfect life. But instead, everything I heard now was about business, about heirs, about what I couldn't give him. That thought was weighing on me with every step. I didn't know what to do, but I intuitively felt that I needed to go to the room where it was all happening. I couldn't just walk away and forget. I couldn't hide from the truth like I had done before. I had to look at it, understand it, and accept it. With each step, I was getting closer to facing what was hidden behind the whole picture. Suddenly, voices came from the living room. I froze and listened, not even realizing that my hand clutching the box had begun to tremble. Me strength. And so, after several days of intense negotiations and meetings with lawyers, Nathan and his attorneys filed a countersuit, demanding a renegotiation of some of the terms of the contract regarding the inheritance. I wasn't surprised. I knew it was coming. From time to time, thoughts flashed through my mind about what would happen if I lost, what would happen if I ended up on the losing end. But each time, I came back to the same thing. I couldn't afford to lose. I couldn't be weak anymore. Nathan continued to use his old methods, trying to undermine my confidence. He was trying to find a weak spot again, habitually manipulating me like he'd done before. But now it was different. I had learned to see through his moves. I was no longer the person who believed in his promises. The process dragged on, but I kept holding on. It was a struggle in which I could make no mistakes. My steps were confident. My decisions were firm. And even as the situation became more and more difficult, I felt that despite everything, I would emerge victorious. It was my choice, my path. My life was finally taking shape in a way that seemed unbelievable to me just a few years ago. At that moment, sitting in my office, I realized that I had done everything I had dreamed of. Nathan and his world were behind me, and I was moving forward, building something of my own. My mornings didn't start with waiting for someone else's decisions or trying to please or guess what would happen next. My life became my own project, and each new day brought something important. But despite this success, I believed in, and the stability that seemed such a welcome outcome. There was something inside me that reminded me of old, forgotten feelings. I couldn't just pick up and let go of what had once tied me to Nathan and his life. It was unbearable to just close the door and forget. It wouldn't be fair that... I couldn't completely put those ties behind me after all. They had shaped me into who I am today. With each passing day, I could feel my present getting stronger, but the memories of my relationship with Nathan still haunted me. Sometimes, when I was in my studio, amongst clients and creative people, I felt a slight emptiness, as if something was still unfinished. And even now that I knew I was moving in the right direction, I had to face the fact that there was still a lot waiting for me. I couldn't go back to Nathan's world. I couldn't forget those betrayals. But at the same time, I realized that the past had left an imprint that couldn't be easily erased. One day, on my way home, I met an old acquaintance. He was one of the people I had once talked to in Nathan's world. We got to talking, and he said a phrase that made me think, "You've changed, Olivia. You look like you finally found yourself." I smiled, but in that moment I felt all thoughts of Nathan and what we'd been through put aside. It was the moment I realized that I had truly changed. I wasn't the woman who had once stood at the door, waiting for Nathan to recognize my worth. I was now defining my own worth. I was becoming more confident every day. I sat in my office and thought that this world I was in was mine. I was the person who was able to choose my own path. It wasn't easy, but looking back now, I realized that each of those sacrifices and mistakes was part of being here where I am now. My business continued to grow. The design studio became a well-known name in town, and I felt the confidence in my own abilities fill me with each new project. I wasn't just working, I was building my own world. The people I was now collaborating with were not part of that Nathan world. They were real, genuine, and appreciated me for my hard work and my personality. It was the moment I realized that I could continue to evolve beyond other people's expectations and standards. My life was full of change, and I embraced it with joy. I learned new things, expanded my horizons, and faced challenges that were natural to growth. But despite all of these positive changes, I knew there was much left unfinished. At some point, I realized that I had to get back to myself. I had to go back to my roots and figure out how I could find peace in my heart. I decided to go to the town where my story with Nathan once began. There I could find answers to the questions that still lingered inside of me. In the evenings, I would sit in cafes, watching life and feeling everything change. This city was full of memories, and as I walked its streets, I felt like I had a chance to complete the cycle that had once been started. I wasn't going back to my old life, but I could leave a part of me where it all began. As I walked down these streets, I thought about how much time had passed. I could go back to Nathan, try to be a part of that world again, but I couldn't anymore. I couldn't be the woman who would go after someone else's ambitions again. I was already different. In that moment, I felt the emptiness disappear. I wasn't looking for any more excuses. I had made my decision. I had freed myself from the past, from what held me back. This city was important, but now it was part of my history, not part of my future. The time I spent in this city allowed me to look back, but it also allowed me to look forward. Everything I had left behind was part of my journey, but now I was no longer letting it define my future. I was coming home with a clarity that filled me with renewed strength. I could say to myself with certainty, I'm ready. I was no longer the woman who doubted her choices, who sought approval. I became a person who made my own decisions and moved forward, regardless of what others expected. My steps became confident as I returned to my office where new projects and tasks awaited. I could feel work bringing me joy again, but this time without remorse or guilt from those who once wanted to control my life. I was the master of my time and my destiny. And yet, no matter how hard I tried, sometimes I found the past trying to break back into my present. I'd get letters from Nathan, though I never opened them again. I knew he was trying to bring me back to his world, but now I was sure that world wasn't mine. It was a world built on calculations, on lies and manipulation, a world I couldn't be happy in. I finally realized that my happiness did not depend on his decisions, on his outlook on life. I continued working with clients, developing my business, finding new ways to grow. Sometimes I stayed in the office late, thinking about the future, about how far I had come. It wasn't just a recovery, it was a rebirth. I was someone new, but at the same time, an old Olivia who had learned to value her freedom and independence. One day, after a long day at work, I was sitting in my office watching it get dark outside the window when the phone rang. It was my brother James. "How are you?" he asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice that was always there, even in the most difficult moments. I smiled. "I'm good, James. Really good," I said, feeling my heart grow light. He had been the one who had supported me all these years, and now that I felt like I had found my way, his voice was a real support for me. "You're not thinking of coming home?" he asked, and I realized what he meant. The question wasn't about what I'd left behind, but what I'd created. "No, this isn't my home, James. My home is what I created here. My home is freedom." When I returned home again, to my coastal town, I felt all the anxiety go away. All around me was a life. That didn't depend on anyone else's expectations. I could look to the future with confidence, knowing that I had made the right choice. As time went on, I continued to work on my business. I met people who appreciated me for my efforts, for my passion, and with each passing day, I felt that what I built wasn't just about business. It was about finding myself. I became the person who lived in alignment with myself. The recovery process was long and difficult, but looking back now, I realize that all those years were just preparation for becoming myself. I was no longer a woman who could be manipulated. I was a woman who made her own decisions. The world had changed, but at the same time, it was still the same. Everything I was looking for, I found within myself. It was my future, my place. I continued to build not only my business, but also my life without looking back at the past. One day I was sitting on my veranda, watching the sea rippling calmly in the setting sun, and I realized that nothing held me to the past anymore. Everything was complete. Nathan, his mother, the old fears were all behind me. I could breathe freely, knowing that my life was now mine alone. I smiled as I looked at my son playing nearby and realized that now all that mattered was the future I was building for me and for him. In this world full of opportunity and change, I was ready for anything. My happiness was in my hands, and I wasn't going to let it go. Couldn't believe my ears when I heard familiar voices: Nathan's voice, Eleanor's, his mother's voice, and her harsh, controlling words that I'd heard so many times before. But they sounded different now, cold and aloof. "She still can't give us an heir," Eleanor said. And there wasn't an ounce of regret in her voice. No regret that she was being so blunt about Nathan and me. She just spoke as if he and I were part of the business, part of her huge game where the roles had long since been determined. I felt something clench inside me. My gaze darkened. In that moment, I realized that our whole life had been this very plan, a plan I didn't fit into. I wasn't his wife. I wasn't his partner. I was just the tool he needed to get the results he wanted. Eleanor continued. As if not noticing me, she was discussing what to do about Vanessa and how to secure the future of the company, even if it cost my love and my happiness. My face was like stone, and I could feel my heart breaking with pain. I always knew she wasn't an ordinary woman. She had always been the kind of person who could manipulate, who could make everyone obey her rules. But now I could feel it all destroying my life. Not knowing what to do, I struggled to take a step forward. And in that moment, I decided that I didn't need to listen to any more of their idle talk. I had a choice to make, and I knew that choice would be mine alone. I walked into the room, and this cold stare came over me. All 3 pairs of eyes met mine at the same time: Nathan, his mother, Eleanor, and Vanessa. In that moment, I felt their presence overwhelm me, as if they were standing in front of me like judges, deciding my fate. There was no warmth in the room, no familiar coziness that we once lived in when everything seemed right. Vanessa, sitting on the couch, made no attempt to hide her pregnancy, which now seemed not just a natural process, but part of some premeditated move. I noticed how she calmly placed her hand on her stomach, as if it was the only thing she needed to take her place in their lives. My body tensed as I met my gaze with Nathan's. He stood there, just as I remembered him, calm, emotionless. He looked at me, but there was no regret in his eyes, just emptiness, like I was just a part of his life, not the person he had once loved. I felt his words that I had heard earlier start to come crashing down on me, and now they resounded in my head with even more force. Vanessa isn't just a woman, she's a business partner. She is needed to provide for an heir. Eleanor stood up and walked over to me, her face remaining impenetrable. She was saying that everything that was happening was just part of a bigger plan, that Vanessa would stay in their home until a permanent place was found for her. She continued to confidently dictate to me that I should accept it, that it was non-negotiable, that everything she was doing was for the well-being of the company. I could feel the pain coursing through me. I couldn't believe this was really happening. My face remained calm, even though inside I was ready to explode. I couldn't be a part of their game anymore, and I wasn't going to accept it. I knew I had to act, that I couldn't just stay silent, that I couldn't stay in the shadow of this family, in the shadow of their ambitions any longer. I stepped forward, picked up the box of tiramisu, and set it on the table without taking my eyes off Nathan. I could feel my voice getting harder, everything I'd been hiding for so long finally coming out. "I'm not going to be a part of this game," I said. And despite the emotions raging inside me, I felt an incredible resolve. Everything I had once known about our marriage, about our future, had been shattered. And now I was ready to move on. I couldn't take my eyes off Nathan, like I was trying to read him. He stood there, in his perfect pose, and it seemed like he hadn't even noticed how I'd changed. He didn't even see that I would no longer follow his instructions, that I would no longer submit to this game I'd never really been a player in. In his eyes, I was no longer important. I had become part of this huge machine that moved without me. Eleanor, noticing that I was standing without having squeezed out a word, approached me with a determined stride. Her gaze, as always, was cold and stern, but this time I felt neither fear nor anxiety. I was ready for whatever she had to say. Eleanor never hid her intentions, and her words always sounded like a judgment. This time she was sure that, despite everything, I would stay and accept her terms. She couldn't let anything disrupt her carefully laid-out plan. "Listen to me, darling," she said with a tone as if she was ready to teach me about life. "You don't understand what's going on. We can't lose everything because of you. You need to accept that. You can't destroy what we've been building. We have no other choice." I felt her words creep into my head, filling its emptiness, but I couldn't just believe it. All I felt was the urge to scream, but at the same time I knew that if I screamed, this game would only get worse. I had to do something, not just be a participant. I didn't want to be a part of this. This wasn't my life. It wasn't my choice. And I wasn't going to submit. Everything in my chest clenched. My hands began to shake, but I stood straight and said, "I don't agree with you. I will no longer be a part of this game. I'm leaving." Nathan, hearing those words, seemed to become even more detached. He didn't try to stop me. His eyes remained blank, and there was no regret or disappointment in his gaze. He didn't know how I felt. He didn't realize how much it hurt me to be a part of this world. His life had been consumed with ambition. His mother had always been on the front lines, deciding people's fates. But now I realized that I didn't want to be a part of it. I could no longer be part of their sacrifices, their calculations. I could no longer be just another step toward accomplishing their goals. I turned around to leave, but at that moment Vanessa, sitting on the couch, said something that made me freeze. Her voice was quiet, almost impassive, but there was something in her words that made my heart sink. "It wasn't personal, Olivia," she said, looking me in the eyes. "It's just business." In that moment, I realized that phrase was the culmination of my entire life with Nathan. All this time, I had hoped that we were something more, that I was more than just a part of his world to him, but now I saw how easily he and his mother could do this to me. It was just business for them. We had never been partners. We were part of a scheme, part of his strategic plan. I was always one position in his game. I sighed, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't talk anymore. I knew words wouldn't change anything. My future couldn't be part of this plan. I walked away. My steps were firm despite everything I felt inside. I couldn't keep this up any longer, and I wasn't going to stay in this house. As soon as I walked out of the house, surrendering one last look at the familiar walls, at everything we had once built together, I felt something inside me break. I knew I wasn't going back. I couldn't go back to this world. Nathan, his mother, and all the games, their ambitions. They didn't make sense to me. I was no longer ready to live in this world where all I meant was a role in his business plans. I felt like I was freeing myself from everything that held me, and though it was a painful choice, I knew I couldn't leave myself room for doubt. I walked away. I walked to my car and got behind the wheel. Everything around me felt like it was in a fog. I couldn't believe this was happening. I couldn't believe that my life would change so drastically. But despite that, I could feel the power within me. It was a strength that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just a release, it was an act of survival. I called James. He didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He just said he'd be there in 30 minutes. I know it wasn't going to be an easy time, but I also knew it was the moment I could start over. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. I didn't know what was coming next, but I was ready to face it. Even though there were many unknowns ahead, I felt like I could move forward. It had been a few days since I left home, and my steps were starting to gain confidence. I could feel each moment giving me back more and more of my sense of control. Of course, I still couldn't shake off the pain and frustration, but at some point I realized that it was all part of the process. I could no longer be in this world where I was just a wife, part of a larger machine, a game in which I had no place. I was now ready to start over, and despite the difficulty of the situation, I felt empowered in that decision. I had to make many changes in my life, and the first of them was making the decision to return to myself. I went to a small coastal town where there was no Nathan or his mother. I was free. This town became a new starting point for me. When I walked into the local cafe and saw the familiar face of James, my brother, I knew I had made the right choice. He was the one person who could understand me, even when I couldn't figure out my own feelings. James was always there for me. He and his husband Michael told me many times that I could start a new life, that I should stop living under the oppression of other people's expectations and ambitions. I decided to open an interior design studio, a business that has always brought me joy. Michael and I spent months discussing how best to get me started. He was an experienced designer, and I felt his ideas helped me find my own style, not eclipsed by anyone else's demands. The adaptation process was not easy. I was sometimes lost in my thoughts, especially when I was reminded of how things used to be. But with each passing day, I felt like this. Life was mine. I was no longer dependent on what others thought, on what I was told. I became independent. I was the master of my own destiny. I decided that I would work for myself. I would build my career the way I wanted, not the way my husband or his mother dictated. Everything I did was now focused on me and my future, not on satisfying someone else's needs. With each passing day, I could feel my business growing stronger. I met a lot of people that I enjoyed working with. It was a world where I could be myself, where I didn't have to worry about meeting other people's expectations. I was creating a space where people could relax, be themselves, and there was something important about that filled me with an inner light. No matter how hard I tried to rid myself of memories of the past, sometimes they still made their way into my thoughts. I was sitting with a cup of coffee in a small cafe, reflecting on how my life had changed. In that moment, I realized that a lot of things had changed, but an even bigger change was within me. I was no longer the woman who doubted my right to happiness. I was stronger than I had ever been. My new beginning was a revelation not only to me, but to those around me. Business was growing, and I was no longer the woman who depended on other people's approval. I was now at the center of my own world. Sometimes, however, I still caught myself thinking about how it all started, how I'd gotten myself into this situation, how I'd spent so long trying to find my way, trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect part of someone else's plan. But now I realized that the world I once thought was mine was a world of other people's expectations, other people's decisions. James and Michael had helped me every step of the way. We were like family, like true friends, and that gave me confidence. Michael was always coming up with ideas for new projects, and James supported me when I had doubts. I started to believe in myself again. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that my old world was a dream, and this new one was real. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that it would all be temporary, that one day I would be back to my old problems. But I knew I couldn't let myself go back. Everything I was creating was for me. It was my path. I opened a new studio, small, cozy, and every project I took on, every client that came in, was a step towards a new phase. The amazing thing was that I started to get recognized. People appreciated what I was doing, and it brought me joy. I felt like I was part of something bigger, not just a business, but something that was built on my own strength. Every day, I grew more confident. Sometimes, as I sat in my cozy office looking out at the city outside my window, I thought about what came before. I thought about Nathan, about how he was always at the center of everything. But now I saw that this was his world, his game. It wasn't like I was going to be just another piece on his field. It was too precious to me. But one day, when I got home and opened the mailbox, I found a letter that made me stop. It was from Nathan. He wrote that he wanted to talk, that everything that had happened wasn't what he thought it was. He said he needed to explain himself. I felt my heart sink. Each day, each step into my new life, I grew more confident. My studio was thriving, I was getting positive feedback from clients, and many people started recommending me to their acquaintances. I was creating a space where people could be themselves, feel comfortable and cozy. In these moments, when I was absorbed in my work, it seemed that everything in the world was right, that every step brought me closer to what I was always looking for, real, independent happiness. Even so, I couldn't forget about my past. The morning I discovered that the world I'd built with Nathan had been a sham was still vivid in my mind. I tried to shake off the memories, trying to dive into my new life, but sometimes they